Well, I think the outlook for Northern Syria is improving day by day. At first, I was quite despondent because it looked like that the Turks were going to roll right in and assert their control over pretty much 1/3 of Syria and expel all of the ethnic minorities there and replace them with Arab Salafis that are sitting in Turkish Syrian refugee camps. But the more time goes on, the less realistic of a possibility that looks. Frankly, I think that this is going to end up looking like a big foreign policy blunder for Erdogan in the long run, because the way things are shaping up, I don't think that he has much of a chance of implementing his plan to any real effect. And that's because it's becoming clear that Russia and Mr. Putin plans to fill the vacuum left by the United States in the area as sort of the big boys in the area, a country that is above the parties squabbling on the ground, that being, the Syrian government, the Turkish government, and then all these various militia groups like the YPG and the FSA. The Russians are even taking over former U.S. facilities and are pretty clearly trying to assert that same role sort of as the, not as peacekeepers, but as referees, I guess you could say. Of course, they're referees with a bias, since obviously they side with, Assad over Erdogan. But I think Russia's presence will have a stabilizing effect, because now they're serving as a buffer between Syria and Turkey. I think they're sending a clear signal to Erdogan that he should not directly engage with Assad, and that essentially you're going to have to go through a few Russians to get to Assad, and of course if you kill some Russians, well then it's game on. And I think Erdogan recognizes this. If you notice, we haven't heard any reports of, Turks directly killing, any Syrian soldiers, meaning like, SAA, Syrian Arab Army guys. No Turkish airstrikes on Assad's forces. They have only really been, dealing with the YPG. And then, but you have heard about the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, or I guess they call them the Syrian National Army now. The guys who, the Turks are siding with, they've been engaging with Assad quite a bit and in fights, but it doesn't sound like, the Turks are giving them any support. So this seems to be very much what, Putin was hoping for. They've essentially neutralized the Turks' air support and their artillery support. Of course, they, as far in as Assad's army is, they don't have any artillery on the ground, but certainly they would have had air support. And so, since the Turks are no longer assisting their Arab allies in the fight against Assad, well, then that just means that this is a regular old mopping up an insurgency, which the Syrian Arab Army has been doing for quite some time. In other words, this is a winnable fight for them. The Free Syrian Army will not be able to conquer northern Syria without air support, and they certainly will not be able to hold it without air support. So even if they, conquer it from the Kurds who are there now, when Assad comes marching in, if the Turks are unwilling to bomb Assad's forces and presumably get into dogfights with the Syrian Air Force, well, then you're going to have quite a problem for the folks on the ground. They're going to be outmatched and ultimately defeated, and probably will escape back into Turkey, and then Erdogan will have his whole Arab refugee problem still on his hands, and he will have lost a war. And so it is my prediction now that after this, Assad will control most of the country except for Idlib province. But it doesn't look to me like the Turks and their allies are going to hold on to this. I just don't think that they have the will to take it that far. If the Turks were willing to, use their full power against Assad, could they defeat him? Obviously, yeah. Turkey's a massive military. If Turkey's military invaded Syria, they could, conquer it not super easily, but certainly they could defeat Assad's army. But Erdogan's not doing that. He's fighting. It's sort of like the Bay of Pigs. If you guys are familiar with the Bay of Pigs operation, the way that was supposed to work was the U.S. trained a bunch of Cuban rebels and then sent them back to Cuba to invade, and they were supposed to give them air support and bombings and things like that. And then the U.S. never gave them any of that air support because they decided they didn't want to fight Cuba. And so the Bay of Pigs invaders got slaughtered. That is what it looks like to me is going to happen with the FSA. I think that, their agreement is probably going to start breaking down. Now, of course, even though this is pretty good news for, the Kurdish people in Syria, because they won't be under threat of ethnic cleansing if the Turks are pushed out, the U.S. media is apoplectic. They are just weeping in anguish over these images that are coming out of Russian troops moving into former American bases. This is absolutely heartbreaking for them. To them, the empire always expands. It never contracts. Once the U.S. has established some outpost somewhere, it's supposed to man that until the end of time. America is bound for world domination in their eyes, and if the U.S. gives up even an inch of ground, that's a major loss, not only to our country but to the planet. And of course, it only adds insult to injury that this little patch of sand in the Middle East that was formerly occupied by the U.S. is now occupied by the Russians, who are, of course, evil incarnate. But I, of course, am quite happy to see the U.S. leaving Syria. I'm glad that they gave it up to Russia. Maybe that, I think Ron Paul made a joke about this yesterday. Maybe we can give them Afghanistan and Iraq, too. Because, these Middle Eastern countries do us no good. They're nothing but trouble. And, think of how many Americans and, civilians on the ground, of course, but, strictly thinking about Americans, just think about how many have died. And for what? To maintain some stupid outpost? We certainly aren't, deterring terrorism or anything like that. We're promoting the very same people that attacked us on 9/11. So it's all a big sham. And I think people are waking up to that. I think that this might end up being a monumental point in American history to where the U.S. actually backed down, and they said, you know what, this is just kind of a waste of our time, and maybe this whole empire thing isn't such a great idea. Maybe it isn't really in our best interests, and obviously the Russians think it's in their best interest. If I were a Russian, I'd oppose Putin going into Syria. But you know what? As an American, I'm very happy that he's taking that burden away from us. And so on that somewhat optimistic note, I would like to end things here today. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.